Hi, and welcome to a tutorial about gnome feet from Imagine Landscapes Designs. What a world that I get to say that phrase. A tutorial on gnome feet. So this is how big the gnome feet are when knit with fingering weight yarn, and since I suggested dark yarn for the shoes, I thought I would do us all a favor and switch from dark yarn to light and from fingering weight to worsted for this tutorial. So this is my gnome foot. I have switched colors. I have done the little cuff of the boot here, and I have increased as in the pattern. Next up is the process of knitting and putting stitches on stitch holders. For a stitch holder, you can either use spare yarn or a removable stitch marker or something like that. So the instructions have us knit So I've knit my 9 stitches, and now I'm going to put the next 2 on the stitch holder, aka my removable needle or my removable stitch marker. Popped right open on me there. All right, then I'm going to continue knitting, so don't worry about this gap. We're just going to close it up by knitting across it. Knit to the end of the round. Doesn't matter how the needles or the stitches are distributed at this point because we're just going to redistribute them right away. All right, so we're now going to go down to just 2 needles. So we're going to redistribute so that we have 9 on each needle. If you're knitting with magic loop or on 2 circulars, you won't have needed to redistribute. So we now have this. The instructions have us take yarn and make sure it's at least an arm's length long and cut it. We are going to Kitchener stitch across, then grab these 2 stitches and make I-cord out of them and then sew them down for the little curlicue toe. I have a video tutorial that is also linked in this pattern as well as linked in the description below that goes into more detail about Kitchener stitch. So I'm not going to do a breakdown right now. I'm just going to show you how this works in terms of getting the gnome to work. But as you can see here, this boot is stuffed enough that it has kind of a presence and a heft, but it doesn't have like a roundness. We don't want, or I didn't want it to look like a big ball on the end of the foot. If you do, the main thing to remember, no matter what you want your foot to look like, is that between stuffing the 2 of them, you stop and take a look and say, hey, is that roughly the amount of stuffing I used last time? Because you don't want to have them look substantially different. So I'm just going to take a little bit of stuffing. What I'm basically looking for is enough stuffing that there is a bit of heft, like, hey, there really could be a 3-dimensional foot in there, and that's all. Then what we do is we're going to Kitchener stitch this across, also known as grafting, and then we're going to make a little I-cord for the curly toe. I have a separate video on grafting or Kitchener stitch, so if you are new to that, I suggest you pause and go watch that. It is linked in the pattern. The pattern name is the ADVENTure Gnome. It's also linked in the description down below. If you really, really hate the idea of Kitchener stitch, you may simply 3 needle bind off. It will produce a different look, obviously. Another option is to sort of sew this shut. You could bind off and sew whatever you want. Personally, I like the look of it with the Kitchener stitch, so I'm going to just graft that shut, come back and show you what we do with the toe. Pull that yarn through, and it's going to look a little funny because of what we've got set up here. Let me set my needles aside. So we have 2 stitches on the holder, and we have the yarn here. We need to take the yarn off the yarn needle because we're now going to knit with it again. Don't put that yarn needle too far away. We're going to need it right away. Then we need just 2 needles because we're going to knit I-cord. So, going to slide my needle through these and remove it from the stitch holder / stitch marker. All right, so we've got 2 stitches, we've got the yarn, and now we just knit I-cord for a little while. You remember with I-cord we work across. We don't turn our work, we just slide through and we keep going. A 2-stitch I-cord feels kind of funny to do, especially after all the 6-stitch I-cord and such that we've been doing for nutmeg. So we've got our I-cord, we've got our foot, and now what we need to do is we need to make this a curly toe. So I'm just going to cut the yarn more like 15 centimeters long, 6 inches or so. Thread the yarn back on the yarn needle. I'm going to go through in the same order I would have knit them if I was working them I-cord. So the yarn is coming off of this one, but I'm actually going to go through into this one and then this one. Pull that to tighten it. Now what we need to do is we need to fasten it down about, let's say here. When we look at stitches, and you'll notice you can see my stuffing through, when I knit this large gnome, this large foot, I was more concerned with having everything be big and visible rather than tight and not letting the stuffing show through. But I will still show you how to kind of cover that up in a moment. So between stitches, there is what is called a running stitch. And that is where the yarn traveled between the loops as we were knitting. And so they look like this. They're just like a little ladder. And so what I suggest you do is you go about halfway up between here and here. Pick a ladder, go underneath it. Whoa, my tail's a little argumentative. There we go. Okay, go through under that ladder and towards the toe. That looks about right, so I'm testing to see if that's going to look about right. Is it too high up? Is it too low down? That sort of thing. And then I'm going to go back through the I-cord, just punch right through it. And then I'm going to go back under that running stitch, that little bit of ladder, and now I'm going to tighten this whole thing. And now I've got a pretty good and well-attached toe loop. So that's all there was to that. Now, of course, we need to get rid of the end. I am going to take advantage of the opportunity to tidy up some of these gaps. What you have in terms of options is you could tie a subtle little knot into it here and just plunge it through and pull it taut and come out. But like I said, it's a great chance to kind of tidy some things up. The back of this can sometimes get a little loose and floppy, or maybe you want a bridge right here. You can kind of come in and do some stuff. So this is a good chance to just figure out where you want to tidy things up. Finishing is a big part of what makes toys look great, and it's also a great chance for you to kind of improve things. So there's finishing and getting your your eyes the right size if you're knitting a toy with eyes or whatever. And eye placement can be a really big deal. Covering up a few little holes like I'm doing right now. See how I just kind of slid my yarn through that ladder? I went through every single stitch in that little gap. I went through every one of those little running stitches, those little bars. And then, yeah, so knitting finishing is a great chance because of the way yarn is flexible and things stretch and change. We can kind of heal things up a little bit. So I'm just going to try to bridge this here by going to where I need to be to do this. It's a bit of an art rather than a science. So I'm just going to kind of try to lock these two halves together across that. Now, this bothers me more because this yarn is pale. Over here in this tiny yarn, I'm not so fussed, right? But I do like to show you guys lots of little techniques. I hope this helped. This has been a tutorial from Imagine Landscapes Designs. Happy knitting and happy gnoming.